Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. I'm Stephen Broom, and today we're going to put two budget-friendly 400 speed black and white films up against one of the greatest of all time, Kodak Tri-X. So stick around and check out the results. A month or so ago, I did an episode comparing three 100 speed films. Two economy priced films, Arista EDU 100 and Kentmere Pan 100 against Kodak T-Max 100. A decidedly non-budget film, but one of my all-time favorites. The results were interesting and a bit eye-opening for me. Before the test, I was absolutely certain that I hated Arista film. After the test, not so much. So I've decided to do the same thing with the 400 speed versions. The main change for this test is that all three films use a traditional grain structure. While the previous test illustrated each film's range of tones, it wasn't overly helpful when comparing grain, since T-Max's tabular grain is a lot less noticeable, and it really wasn't fair to compare the other films to that. In hindsight, Ilford FP4 would have been a better choice than the T-Max, but for this test, all films will have the same grain structure. For my methodology, I'll be using my Bronica S2A with three separate film backs, so each film will be getting the exact same exposure. And I'll be using a tripod to keep the framing as close as possible for each. For development, I'll be processing each according to the manufacturer's specs using D76 in the 1:1 dilution and intermittent agitation. And as a final frame of reference, Kodak Tri-X is priced at about $9 per 120 roll. And the Arista and Kentmere are just under $6 per 120 roll. So the main question to answer here will be, is Kodak Tri-X worth paying 50% more for? So let's go have some fun. So the reason for the shoot today is to do comparison on three different types of black and white film. We'll start with Arista EDU 400, then we've got the new Kentmere Pan 400, and then I'm going to finish that off with my old favorite Tri-X 400. They all have the traditional grain structure, so this should be an interesting test between them. I'm just downtown Carrollton, Georgia. I'm gonna wander around a bit. I've got three different backs for the S2A, so I've got Arista in one, Kentmere in another, and Tri-X in the other one. So everything's gonna be the same. The focal length, the camera, the shutter speeds, the only thing that's gonna be changing from shot to shot is gonna be the film. And as usual for this exercise, I'm gonna be using my trusty Minolta Spot Meter F, which allows me to meter the brightest highlight point and the darkest shadow point in a shot and average the two to get an exposure that should hopefully get both of them into the exposure latitude of the film. So I've got one shot lined up. So let's get it metered and see what we've got. All right, so I'm gonna go with a shadow area first. Now with a highlight spot. All right, so it's telling me at 1/250th of a second at f11 and a half. All right, so let's do 1/500th of a second at f8 and a half. Dark slide out. So this is the Arista EDU first. Put the swap backs. All right, next up is the Kentmere 400 pan. Actually, these are going to be overexposed because I did not change my shutter speed to 2/50th of a second. So we are at 2/50th of a second at f8 and 11, 8 and a half. So this set, it's going to be a stop overexposed, which I guess is good to find out how that works. So we'll overexpose all of them to keep everything the same. And I'll also do a underexposed shot 2 just to keep everything consistent. Because one thing that I found when working with the 100 speed version of this test is I underexposed the shot 2 stops by accident, and it was cool to see how film dealt with underexposure. So this time we'll see over. All right, I have the next shot lined up. I'm going to change the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second.
and then we'll meter off of that. Clear my memory. All right, so let's see where's the shadow and where's the highlight. All right, let's check that. All right, 16, F16, F16, all right. So the sky, we're shooting into the shadows, but the sky is very blue, and I'm getting a reading of F16.5 on the sky, as well as F16.7 on another highlight area of the birdhouse. So I'm gonna go with that one since that's actually in the frame. All right, so let's measure that highlight. 16.6, measure, memory, and where is my shadow area? All right, 2.8.7. All right, that's a good range there. So I've got F8 at 1/500th of a second. F8 at 1/500th of a second. And we are starting with the Tri-X. All right, and dark slide out. Dark slide in. And in case you're wondering, the camera will not fire if the dark slide is in, and also you cannot remove the back unless the dark slide is in. So that's a cool feature with the Bronica S2, S2A, because it sure does save me some wasted frames. All right, so this is the Carrollton Center for the Arts. It's a nice bit of architecture downtown Carrollton, and I like the way we get these angles right through here. I like the shadow, got the tree, so let's make something out of that. All right, framed up here. All right, so let's see where my highlights are and my shadows. All right. I've got two places that could possibly be a highlight. I've got a very bright sign across the road, and then I also have, well, it's going to be about equal. All right, so about F16.5 is my brightest point. Let's find some shadow. 0.6, F4. All right, so there's my shadow. All right, so F8.5 at 1/500th of a second. All right, let's go with F11.5 at 1/250th of a second. Arista EDU 400 is in here first. Dark slide out. Dark slide in. All right, move on to the next shot. All right, so I've got the rotunda, this column section, and down the length of the building. I've swapped over to the 75 2.8 lens. I had been using the 150. All right, so let's get this metered up. Got some shadow area along the bricks down that way, and the highlights are definitely going to be the sunny side of this rotunda thing. All right, let's do 1/250th of a second and see what we've got. All right, so let's meter highlights. 32.3. Wow. All right, shadow is 5.6. So that's giving me 1/250th of a second at F16. All right, let's go. First up is the Kentmere Pan 400. Dark slide out. So here's a nice little scene, very contrasty lighting. We are in direct sun, but we have some shading from a tree that's overhead. I'm gonna put on the 150 millimeter again and get a closer shot of this water and the rocks right there. I've got plenty of shadow area to choose from, but I don't know how much. I think the only highlight area I have is the fountain portion. So let's check it and see. All right, let's start at a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Let's highlight. Shadow. So it gives me 1/500th of a second at f4.5. So let's go 1/125th of a second at f8.5. So behind me I have some fall decorations. It'll be a good enough subject for this test. So let's check it out. All right, so I've metered it. And I have an exposure of 1/250th of a second at f4.5. And up first we have the Arista EDU. Found another shot here. We got these lanterns hanging over this door threshold. Don't really have any bright highlights or dark shadows, so I'm doing the best I can with what we've got. There is a slightly bright spot in the threshold over the door, and in the shadow of one of the lanterns, there is a slightly dark. Anyway, what I've got, I'm gonna shoot this two ways. I'm gonna shoot it with a deeper depth of field and one shallower depth of field. So first, we'll do the deep depth of field at 1/30th of a second at f8. All right, so I'm going to get a shallow depth of field version of this as well. Actually, I'm gonna shoot this wide open. So at 1/250th of a second at 3.5. I think the camera slightly moved. So I think I'm gonna finish up this roll in this spot. So what I've tried to do, I've tried to get some symmetry here with the archway and part of the round stained glass at the top. I'm gonna meter it. I'm gonna shoot it correctly or as to what the meter is suggesting. Then I'm gonna underexpose by 2 stops just to see what flexibility these films have with that sort of thing. I've got the 75 2.8 on it. And let's go. We're starting with Tri-X. All right, so let's quickly do a 2-stop underexposure. All right, 2 stops under. And to do that, I'm moving it to f16. f8. Two stops under, f16. So much for all of them being exactly the same. Right, so I've got one more shot for each of these rolls. So for this shot, I'm just gonna do another perspective shot down these columns. I'm not gonna go for deep depth of field on this. I'm gonna go for fairly shallow. So I want to choose f5.6 as my aperture. So let's find out what we are going to meter. So that is 1/60th of a second at 5.6. First is the Kentmere Pan 400. All right, that finishes that roll up. Finishes that roll up. All right. So now we'll just get back, process these, and look at the results.
So let's take a look at what we have. First thing I notice, and just like the 100 speed test, the Kentmere film looks significantly more dense, like it's overexposed by at least a stop. But we'll see what effect that has once we get into the comparisons. And unlike the 100 speed comparison video, I have adjusted each negative for contrast using curves in Photoshop by setting the black point based on the clear film base of the negative, as well as adjusting the white point to give us a decent looking photo. In the 100 speed video, I only adjusted the black point and presented the shots as straight out of the camera. They were extraordinarily dull and flat and didn't really reflect how the shots might be used. The important thing to note about this is that even though the black point and white point have been reset for optimum contrast, all the tones in the middle still retain their relative position on the curve. If one film has more tones toward the low middle range on the raw negative, they'll still have the same relative distribution on the corrected curve. And here's an example. The raw negative scan on the left is flat and dull, and you can see by looking at the curves that all the tones are in the middle with no real black or white point. But there is a spike in tones in the upper middle area. In this example, the same negative has been adjusted for contrast by assigning a black point and a white point. Now the shot has good contrast overall, and you'll notice that it still has the spike in tones towards the upper middle range. It's just in a slightly different area. Alright, let's get into it. Shot 1 is the one I accidentally overexposed by one stop. And it's a good thing that I did that so we can see how these films respond to exposure mistakes. The Arista shot doesn't look overexposed in the slightest. The Tri-X shot looks good and has good contrast with shadows that are nice and open. And the Kentmere shot also looks good with slightly less contrast than the Tri-X, but still has open shadows. We'll come back to these shots and look at their tonal ranges separately once we get through the list. In shot 2, we can see that the Arista has significantly darker midtones, the Tri-X shot looks good throughout, and the Kentmere shot has significantly brighter midtones. In shot 3, the Arista has good range of tones with decent contrast. The Tri-X shot here has more contrast and more even distributions of midtones, I think, and the Kentmere is looking a bit overexposed with less contrast. Shot 4 tells a similar story. The Arista has good contrast but has more tones in the lower mid-range, and I think this is why Arista has never been one of my favorite films. That grouping of lower range midtones looks muddy to me, and there's not a great deal of separation among those tones. The Tri-X, on the other hand, looks great, with great separation in the midtones, and I guess this is one reason why Tri-X is such a popular film and why it's remained in production for decades. The Kentmere shot here, though, could use a boost in contrast. Shot 5 looks like an exposure error. Except for the Arista, they look overexposed. The setting for these was 1/250th of a second at f16. So even if I'd gone with the Sunny 16 rule, this setting would have only been one stop over. To me, it looks like more, though, especially the Kentmere shot. In shot 6, the Arista and the Kodak look really good with open shadows with a slight nod to the Tri-X for contrast. The Kentmere is the opposite of the Arista. Brighter tones overall, but still needs a boost in contrast. For shot 7, I'm really liking the Arista for overall contrast and tones. The Kodak shot is slightly brighter and could use a small boost of contrast, and the Kentmere could use a similar boost in contrast to get it to my liking. Shot number 8, I think, perfectly illustrates the differences in these films. The Kodak shot in the middle has great tonal range and contrast. The Arista on the left has more low mids. The Kentmere on the right has more high mids, and both of those could use more contrast. If we punch in on the shadow areas, you can really see those differences. Shot number 9 is very similar to shot number 8 with just a change in exposure settings to reduce depth of field. Overall, they're a little bit darker than those last shots, but that's most likely an issue with the camera shutter speeds being slightly out of adjustment. Shot number 10 is the same story as most of the rest. The Arista has more low midtones, the Kentmere has more high mids, and the Kodak is right in the middle. Shot number 11 is the one I underexposed by 2 stops. I think they all held up very well, and I think the Tri-X shot is the best overall with good contrast. The Kentmere seems to have less contrast than both the Arista and the Kodak and looks a bit flat. The contrast on the Arista shot is pretty good, but not up to the level of the Tri-X. We'll also come back to this one in just a bit to look at the tone curves. On shot number 12, I think I prefer the Arista over the other two, or at least the Kentmere. The Kentmere just doesn't have enough contrast for my liking, and even though the Arista is darker overall, I think it represents the tones best. And no surprise, the Tri-X is right in the middle. I think any of these could be made to work with additional adjustments. Alright, so let's go back and take a closer look at the frames that were overexposed. If you recall, the first shot was overexposed accidentally by 1 stop. So let's look at the Tri-X shot first. If you ask me, the exposure doesn't look bad. All the tones are grouped in the center and none are really clipped to the right. 1 stop over is handled pretty well by the Tri-X. Next up, let's look at the Kentmere negative. It also looks like a decent exposure. Tones are grouped in the middle and none are pushed too far over to the highlight side. It's pretty similar to the Tri-X. But this is where it gets interesting. If we look at the histograms for both the Kentmere and the Tri-X, it's easy to see that Tri-X has more dynamic range. Finally, let's take a look at the Arista version of shot 1. This histogram absolutely does not look like it's from an overexposed negative. If anything, it looks underexposed. If we look at these histograms side by side, we can see that the highlights are in line and are nearly the same as that of the Tri-X, but the rest of the dynamic range is obviously skewed toward the shadow side. And we can see that the Kentmere range is similar to Tri-X, but the dynamic range is a bit less. Now let's look at the shot I underexposed by 2 stops. The Tri-X dynamic range is shifted to the shadow side as we'd expect, and some of the tones on that shadow side do get crushed. The Kentmere shot shows almost the exact same thing. The Arista shot isn't quite as crushed in the blacks, but it's definitely heavy in the lower mid dynamic range. And of course we can't claim we're comparing films if we don't look at grain. I chose to look at shot number 4 to make the comparison since it has a portion of clear sky. If we punch in super tight, we can get a good look at the grain. I think the Tri-X in the center is the clear winner here. The grain is pleasing and noticeably less than the other two, and the sharpness is excellent, as you can see on the brickwork there. I think the Arista comes in second for acceptable grain, and the Kentmere, well, that is not pleasant looking grain. It's quite clumpy and just, well, it's ugly. So this has been a lot of info, and it seems we've been pretty deep in the weeds here. But if we consider all of this, what is the actual bottom line? Well, I think I've proven to myself at least why I prefer Kodak Tri-X for a great 400 speed film. Now before you say it, I'm pretty sure I love Ilford HP5 as well, but I didn't have 4 film backs to add it to the test. I'm going to assume that it would compare quite favorably to the Tri-X. But anyway, Tri-X shows a wide dynamic range with pleasing grain and great sharpness, and overexposed or underexposed, it can still provide good images. I think I could probably rate it at an exposure index of 800 and still get great negatives without pushing it in development. Likewise, I think it could be shot at an exposure index of 200 and processed normally and still provide its entire dynamic range. For the Kentmere 400, I think it's a great film that skews its dynamic range to the upper midtones, and that explains why the negatives appear dense. It doesn't have quite the dynamic range that the Tri-X has, but it's still very good. I also think I'd be fine shooting this at an EI of 800 and processing normally for good negatives. Shooting at an EI of 200 and processing normally doesn't seem to hurt this film either. The only fault I'd assign to the film is that its grain is unattractive, and it seems to be the grainiest of the 3. Now, for the Arista film. To me, this film performs more like a 200 speed film when processed normally. Its dynamic range is most definitely skewed toward the low midtones, and I don't think it's a film I'd reach for if I needed a 400 speed stock. Its grain is slightly better than Kentmere, but not anywhere close to the nice grain and sharpness of the Tri-X. So there you go. I've tried to be as thorough as possible, but I'm sure there are some variables that can exist. For example, what happens when I process the Kentmere in Ilfosol 3 and not D76? I don't know. But I have some Ilfosol and will be running some Kentmere with it soon. I'll especially be interested in how or if that will affect the grain. I hope it does, as that's really the only drawback I see of using this film on a regular basis. So thanks for watching me get more technical than usual, and I hope you weren't too bored. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. And speaking of that, I hit 1,000 subscribers last week, so a big thank you to all who continue to tune in and support this channel. I'll see you next time.